Now, every relation has a domain and range. How can we find the domain and range when we don't have just a list of pairs, but we have, for example, the graph of the relation? Remember that the domain consists of all of the first entries in the pairs, and the range consists of all the second entries. In a graph, the first entry is the x-coordinate, the second entry is the y-coordinate. So we can find the domain and range by doing what's called projecting. That just means squishing the graph down into the axes. So here's what that means. Here's the graph of a relation we're calling S. To find the domain, right, the domain lives in the x-axis. We imagine we take all of the points on this graph and we squish them in to the x-axis. So we get something like this. And we see there's a point over here at -3 that squishes down to the -3 on the x-axis. And over here we have an empty dot at +4. Right? There's no actual point on this graph that squishes to +4, although we get as close as we'd like. And now looking at what we have in the x-axis, we see that that's an interval. And so we can describe that in interval notation. We start at -3, which has a filled in dot, so that's a square bracket. We go to +4, which has an empty dot, so that gets a round bracket. So that's how we find the domain. We squish everything into the x-axis. To find the range, we'll squish everything into the y-axis. So we'll think every point on this graph, we can pull over into the y-axis, and we get something like this. At the top here, there's that filled in dot that projects to the +2 on the y-axis. We have that empty dot that projects to the -2. And so again, we kind of have to turn our heads to the side, but that y-axis is also a number line. We also have an interval in the y-axis. Instead of going left to right, it goes bottom to top. At the bottom, we have a -2, which has an empty dot, so that gets a round bracket. At the top, we have a +2, which has a filled in dot, so that gets a square bracket. So the domain and range are just the intervals that we get in the x and y axis when we project our graph down like that. Let's see another example. So here's a relation that's got these two chunks. It's a little bit more complicated, but we find the domain and range just the same way. For the domain, again, we're thinking we're going to just squish into the x-axis. So all of these points pull up into the x-axis. All of these points pull down into the x-axis. And we've got, let's see, everything in here, and then everything in here, and then all of this stuff over here. So 3, there's no point that actually projects to 3, so we have an empty dot at 3. -1, both of these points project to -1, so there's no issue with -1. -2, we have an empty dot here, but we have a point on the graph here, so -2 is going to be part of the domain. Then -4, again, we have an empty dot because there's no actual point that projects onto -4. So the domain, we have just one interval. At the left, we have a -4 with an empty dot, so we have a round bracket. At the right, we have a 3, again with an empty dot, so we have a round bracket. Okay, what about the range? So the range, we're going to project onto the axis like this, just pulling everything to the axis. And it looks like we've got some of the range in here. Right, so we've got this empty dot at +3 and this empty dot at -1. And then there's nothing between 0 and 1. But then we've got some more range down here. And let's see. We'll have an empty dot at -4. And then this -1, oh, well, both of these points are on the graph and have y-coordinate -1. That's no problem. What about at the top here? We just have this point on the graph. That is a point that's actually on the graph, though, right? This -2, 1 is a point on the graph. I'm sorry, this -2, 0 is a point on the graph. And so we do actually have a point on the graph with y-coordinate 0. So we have a filled in dot there. How do we write that? We notice that there's a gap there. So we need to write that as a union of intervals. Right? The first one goes from -4 up to 0. Right? Empty dot at -4, filled in dot at 0. Union with 1 up to 3. And both of those have empty dots. So if we have a graph and we want to find the domain and range, we just imagine squishing the graph into the x-axis to get the domain, into the y-axis to get the range.